In the year 64 AD, the city of Rome burned for 6 days. When it was over, entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash. Hundreds of thousands of people lost everything they owned overnight, with no warning, no preparation, and no time to do anything except run. The fire destroyed an estimated 10 of Rome's 14 districts, starting in the merchant shops near the Circus Maximus and spreading faster than anyone could contain it, driven by wind through streets too narrow for the fire to be stopped. People who had gone to sleep wealthy woke up with nothing. Merchants who kept their savings in goods stored in warehouses watched those warehouses go. Landlords who owned apartment blocks in the affected districts lost both the buildings and the rent income they represented. The entire financial reality of the largest, richest city in the world reset in less than a week. Seneca was there. He had lived through exile under Claudius, political purges under Caligula, the assassination of multiple emperors, currency debasement under Nero, and now a fire that rewrote the financial landscape of the entire city in days. He was not surprised by any of it. Not because he could predict the specific event, nobody predicted the Great Fire, but because he had spent decades preparing for the fact that an event like it was inevitable. Disruption was not an aberration in Roman life, it was the pattern, and the decisions he made with his money in the years before the fire, not after it, were the reason he remained solvent when people who had been richer than him were starting from nothing. Right now, the signals are everywhere that something is building. Inflation that central banks keep insisting is under control, while your grocery bill tells a different story every week. Government, corporate, and household debt levels that have no real historical precedent, asset prices in multiple categories that require near-perfect future conditions to justify where they are today, geopolitical stress between major powers running at levels not seen in decades. Any one of those in isolation would be manageable, all of them running simultaneously in a globally interconnected financial system where a problem in one place transmits to every other place faster than any previous generation has experienced, is the exact kind of combination Seneca would have recognized immediately and started preparing for quietly. This video is not a prediction. Nobody can tell you with certainty when the next crisis hits or exactly what form it takes. What Seneca left behind in his letters and essays is something more useful than a prediction. It's a framework for positioning yourself financially so that when it does come, you are not among the people who lose everything because they were unprepared, and potentially among the people who come out stronger on the other side because they were ready. Here is what Seneca actually did, what the Stoic framework prescribes, and the specific moves that translate directly to your situation right now. The first thing to understand is how Seneca thought about crisis itself, because his framework starts from a completely different premise than most financial advice. Modern financial planning is built almost entirely around optimizing for the normal case. Diversify your portfolio for average market conditions. Build a budget based on your current income continuing. Plan retirement on the assumption that the market will return roughly what it's returned historically. All of this is reasonable in a stable system. The problem is that stable systems produce stable thinking, and stable thinking is the exact condition that makes a crisis maximally destructive when it arrives, because nobody prepared for it while things were good, which is the only time preparation is actually affordable. Seneca's approach flips this completely. He writes in letter 91, which he composed specifically in response to the sudden destruction of the city of Lugdunum, burned to the ground in a single night while everyone slept, "We should anticipate all things, and we should think about everything that can happen as though it will happen to us." This isn't pessimism. It's what he calls premeditatio malorum, the deliberate, systematic mental rehearsal of bad outcomes, applied not just psychologically, but financially. The practical translation of this is simple and uncomfortable for most people to actually execute. You structure your financial situation around the assumption that disruption will happen, not with the hope that it won't. Not with paranoia, but with the same calm, methodical preparation that a ship captain uses when charting a course through waters where storms are a known seasonal probability. The captain doesn't know exactly when the storm comes. He knows his ship is built to handle it and his cargo is secured, which means when it arrives, he's navigating while everyone else is panicking. The second principle in Seneca's framework is what he calls the essential versus expendable, and it's the most practically useful idea in all of his financial writing. In letter 18, the same letter where he describes the poverty test we covered last week, he makes an argument that most people in comfortable circumstances will find difficult to accept. The only financial position that is genuinely stable is one where your survival does not depend on conditions remaining good. Not comfortable, stable. If your ability to pay your rent, your food, and your essential obligations requires your income to stay constant, your investments to keep performing, and your employer to keep valuing your role, you don't have financial stability. You have financial fragility with a comfortable surface. The Stoics used a specific term for this kind of false security. They called it building on sand, not as a moral judgment, but as a structural observation. Sand looks solid until the conditions under it change. Real financial stability means your essential floor, the minimum cost of your actual life, stripped of the discretionary layer, is covered by resources that don't depend on everything going right simultaneously. Practically, Seneca's version of this was maintaining a portion of his wealth in forms that were highly portable, highly liquid, and entirely independent of the Roman financial system's current performance. Land generates income, but it can't be moved. Loans generate interest, but they can go bad. The portion of his wealth he kept outside those forms, in physical assets that he controlled directly without counterparty risk, was what allowed him to function through multiple crises that destroyed the liquid wealth of people around him. The modern translation, cash reserves, held outside systems that require other parties to remain solvent. Not all of your savings, not most of it, a specific, deliberate floor that covers your essential obligations for a defined period without requiring you to sell anything, borrow anything, or depend on anyone else's continued functioning. Most financial advisors will tell you 3 to 6 months. For a genuine crisis preparation framework, 6 to 12 months is the Stoic position, and it should be held in the most stable, accessible form available to you. The third principle, and the one most people skip because it requires the most immediate discomfort, is debt reduction before the crisis, not during it. Seneca's position on debt is the most unambiguous financial stance he takes across all of his writing. He describes debt as a transfer of sovereignty, not a moral failing, a structural condition. When you owe money to someone, a portion of every future decision you make about your job, your location, your risk tolerance is being made by the person you owe it to, whether or not they're in the room. The debtor is always negotiating from weakness because the one thing the debtor cannot afford is for the creditor to call the debt due at an inconvenient time. In a crisis, inconvenient timing is the entire nature of the event. Employers cut payrolls at exactly the moment when you most need the income. Credit lines get reduced or eliminated at exactly the moment when you most need the liquidity. Asset prices fall at exactly the moment when you might be forced to sell to cover obligations. Banks tighten lending standards at exactly the moment when borrowing to bridge a gap becomes the only option you have left. Every financial vulnerability gets stressed simultaneously because that's what a crisis does. It's the moment when all the contingencies that weren't supposed to happen at the same time happen at the same time, with no gap between them to recover in. The person who enters a crisis with significant consumer debt, credit card balances, personal loans, variable rate obligations, is negotiating under all of those conditions at once from a position where the creditor's leverage is maximum and their own leverage is minimum. They can't afford to wait the crisis out because the debt is accruing whether they're earning or not. They can't afford to take lower paying work because the minimum payments require a certain income floor. They can't afford to make opportunistic moves because every available dollar is already committed to past decisions. The debt turns what could have been a rough period into a trap with no exit until the payments are gone, which in a crisis might be years longer than it was during good times.
The person who enters a crisis with minimal consumer debt and a cash floor is negotiating from a position where most of the options remain open, including options that become extraordinarily valuable during crises and are available only to people who prepared before them, buying assets from people who need to sell them cheaply and quickly, simply waiting longer than anyone around them can afford to wait, taking calculated risks on opportunities that require patience rather than urgency. Seneca didn't become one of the wealthiest men in Rome by outworking everyone. He stayed wealthy through multiple crises by being the person in the room who didn't need the next 30 days to go perfectly. Seneca's practical instruction, drawn from multiple letters, can be compressed into one sentence: reduce what you owe faster than you reduce what you own. Most financial planning does the opposite, carrying debt because the interest rate seems manageable while keeping money in savings or investments that theoretically outperform the debt cost. This is sound mathematics in normal conditions and catastrophic strategy when conditions stop being normal, because in a crisis the investments fall in value at the same time the debt becomes harder to service, compressing both sides of the calculation simultaneously. The fourth principle is diversification, but not the kind most people think. When finance content talks about diversification, it almost always means diversifying across asset classes within a financial system: stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities. Seneca's diversification is broader than that and operates at a different level. He maintained income and assets that were not all dependent on the same system remaining functional. Consider the three sources of his wealth we covered in the previous video: land generating agricultural income, lending generating interest income, and patronage generating relationship-based income. These three sources fail under completely different conditions. Agricultural income fails under drought, plague, or military disruption of specific regions. Lending income fails under economic collapse or default by specific borrowers. Patronage income fails under political instability affecting specific relationships. All three failing simultaneously requires a level of total systemic collapse that is rare enough that Seneca was willing to treat it as an acceptable residual risk. The modern equivalent is not just diversifying your investments, but diversifying the systems your income and assets depend on. A person whose income comes entirely from a single employer, whose savings are entirely in that employer's industry's stock, and whose largest asset is a property in a single city, is not diversified regardless of what their brokerage account looks like. A person with income from multiple sources across different sectors, savings partially in assets that don't require the financial system to keep functioning normally, and skills valuable across multiple contexts, is structurally similar to Seneca's three-source model.
The fifth and final principle is the one Seneca returns to more often than any other across his entire body of writing, and it's the only one that doesn't show up in any standard financial planning framework. Know your number. By his number, he means the minimum resource level at which your life remains genuinely functional and the things you most value remain intact. Not comfortable, functional. Not optimal, intact. He writes about this across dozens of letters, always returning to the same observation. Most people don't know this number, which means they are perpetually afraid of a level of loss they've never actually calculated, defending a lifestyle whose actual essential cost they've never honestly identified. The person who doesn't know their floor will spend a crisis defending everything, which usually means losing everything, because defending everything requires the one resource a crisis most reliably destroys, which is time. The person who knows their floor, who has thought carefully about which possessions, obligations, and expenditures are genuinely essential to the life they actually want versus the ones that are simply habitual, can make the cuts quickly when cuts become necessary, protect what actually matters, and use the psychological energy they're not spending on panic to identify the opportunities that crises reliably create for people who are positioned to see them. Seneca lost enormous wealth multiple times, to exile, to political confiscation, to the economic disruptions of 4 different emperors. He was never destroyed by any of it, not because he was lucky, but because he had already thought clearly about what actually mattered to him, which meant he always knew what he was actually protecting and what he could afford to release. The moves that translate to your situation right now are simpler than most crisis content will tell you, because Seneca's framework is not about complicated strategies. It's about structural preparation that most people delay because conditions haven't forced it yet.
Start with the cash floor. Calculate your actual essential monthly expenses, rent or mortgage, food, utilities, minimum debt payments, and set a target of 6 to 12 months of that amount held in the most stable, accessible form available, not invested, held. If you don't have that yet, this is the first financial priority before anything else. Accelerate debt reduction on anything with variable rates or anything that could be called due under changed conditions. Fixed-rate long-term debt on appreciating assets is a different conversation. Consumer debt and revolving credit lines are what the Stoic framework targets first. Find your diversification gaps. How many independent systems does your income currently depend on? How many of your assets fail under the same conditions? Variety inside one system is not diversification in Seneca's sense. Exposure across different systems that fail under different conditions is. Finally, run the number. What is the actual minimum monthly cost of the life you actually need, not the life you currently have? That number is your floor, and knowing it precisely is the single most practical output of Seneca's entire financial framework. The crisis will come in a form nobody predicted at a time nobody planned for. It always does. Seneca understood that preparation has to happen before the signal is obvious, because by the time the signal is obvious, the price of preparation has already gone up, and the window to execute cleanly has already started closing. Start now. Not because something is definitely coming, because starting now is the only version you won't regret. Subscribe because the next video goes into the specific Stoic checklist for evaluating any financial decision under uncertainty, the exact questions Seneca asked before committing resources to anything, and why that framework would have prevented almost every major financial mistake most people make.